My phone rang at 11:47 at night, and I almost didn't answer it. I was sitting in the parking garage of a downtown office building, still in my work clothes, tie loosened, window cracked just enough to let in the cold air. I had just finished a 2-hour client call that drained every last drop of energy I had left. All I wanted was to drive home, fall into bed, and stop thinking for a few hours. The phone buzzing on the passenger seat felt like one more demand from a day that had already taken too much from me. I looked at the screen. It was Marcus, the plumber I had hired earlier that week to fix a leak under the kitchen sink. I remember staring at his name for a moment longer than I should have, trying to decide if whatever he wanted could wait until morning. I answered because something told me not to ignore it. Not a dramatic feeling, not a premonition, just a small, quiet instinct that nudged me. I've thought about that moment 100 times since. What would have happened if I had let it ring? If I had tossed the phone in the cup holder and driven home and gone to sleep? The world looks completely different depending on whether you answer that call or not. I answered. His voice stopped me before I could even say hello properly. There was something in it that I had never heard from a stranger before. A kind of careful, controlled fear. The voice of a man who was trying very hard to sound calm and failing at it in small, telling ways. He spoke slowly. His words came out measured, like he was placing them down one at a time on a surface he wasn't sure would hold the weight. When someone talks to you like that, your body understands it before your brain does. My chest tightened before I even processed what he was saying. Something was wrong. Not with the pipe. Not with the house in any ordinary sense. Something else entirely. He told me he had finished the sink. Of course he had. That part was simple, routine. The whole reason I had hired him in the first place. A leaking pipe under the kitchen counter. Nothing unusual, nothing complicated. I had given him the keypad code to the front door because I wasn't sure I'd make it home before he arrived, and Marcus had come and gone and done his job. That was supposed to be the end of it. A transaction, a fixed pipe, a paid invoice. The ordinary machinery of adult life, clicking along the way it was supposed to. But then he said there was something else. In the basement. I asked him what he meant. He said he didn't want to explain it over the phone. He said I should come. He said it in a way that made it clear this was not a suggestion and not a small thing and not something that was going to have an easy explanation waiting at the other end. His voice had dropped lower by then, like he was worried about being overheard, which made no sense because he was alone in my house and I was alone in a parking garage and there was no one around for either of us to be worried about. But fear doesn't follow logic. It follows its own rules entirely, and whatever Marcus had found in my basement had scared him enough to change the way he breathed on the phone. I drove home in a way I'm not proud of. I don't remember specific streets or lights. I remember the feeling of my hands on the wheel and the cold air coming through the vent and the kind of rising noise in my own head that wasn't quite panic, but was moving in that direction. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. A gas smell, a structural crack, something expensive but explainable. I told myself that because the alternative, letting my mind go to the places it was trying to go, felt too large to sit with while also driving a car at speed through a city at midnight. Marcus was standing in the kitchen when I walked in. He had his jacket on and his tools packed and his truck keys in his hand, and he looked like a man who had been waiting to leave for a while but felt he couldn't until I arrived. He didn't say much. He just looked at me with that expression, the specific expression of someone who knows something you don't and is not sure they had the right to find it out. And he pointed to the basement door. That moment, that is the moment that splits my life into two halves. The half where I walked to that door and the half where I opened it and went down the stairs. Every single thing about my existence on the other side of that door was different from everything I had believed to be true on this side of it. I didn't know that yet. I was just a tired man in a parking garage jacket walking toward a basement in his own house because a plumber had called him with a shaking voice. There are moments in life that look completely ordinary from the outside while they are, in fact, the hinge point of everything. This was one of those moments. A staircase, a light switch, the smell of cold concrete and old cardboard, and something I couldn't name yet. My hand on the railing. One step, then another. I had no idea what I was about to find, but somewhere in the back of my body, below the level of thought, Something already knew that the life I was walking into that basement with was not the life I was going to walk back out with. I was not the kind of man who was handed anything. That is not self-pity. That is just the plain truth of where I came from and what it cost me to get anywhere at all. I grew up in a small town in Ohio that most people have never heard of and never will. The kind of town where the same families have worked the same jobs for 3 generations, where ambition is viewed with a kind of quiet suspicion, where leaving is either the bravest thing you can do or the most ungrateful, depending on who you ask. My father worked double shifts at a printing factory for most of my childhood. He smelled like ink and machine oil when he came home, and he was usually too tired to say much. But he said enough. He said work hard. He said don't complain. He said nothing in this world comes looking for you. You have to go find it yourself. I believed him. I still do. Over the weeks that followed, more small things accumulated. She started keeping her phone face down on every surface. Before, she had never cared where her phone landed or who might see the screen. Now it was always face down, always within reach, always retrieved quickly if she needed to leave the room. She started going to the gym before sunrise, which surprised me because Sandra had always been someone who needed 3 alarms and a full cup of coffee before she could engage with the world in any meaningful way. Suddenly, she was up at 5:30, gym bag by the door, gone before I had finished my first cup. She bought new clothes, not unusual in itself, but these were different from her usual choices. More deliberate, more considered. She came home one evening wearing a perfume I had never smelled on her before, something warmer and more expensive than what she normally wore. And when I said I liked it, she told me a colleague had recommended it and changed the subject so smoothly I almost didn't notice the pivot. I noticed, but noticing and knowing are 2 entirely different things, and I was not ready to close the distance between them. So I did what a lot of men do when they sense something they are not prepared to face. I rationalized. I told myself she was going through a phase of self-reinvention, the kind that happens to people in their late 30s, when they look up from the business of daily life and feel an urgency to reclaim something about themselves. I told myself the late nights were genuinely work-related because she had mentioned a new project, a difficult client, an upcoming deadline. I told myself the phone thing was just a new habit, maybe something she had read about, digital boundaries or mindfulness or whatever the current language was for not wanting to be constantly available. I constructed a version of events that was innocent and plausible and required nothing difficult from me, and I lived inside it for longer than I should have. Then I found the message. I wasn't looking for it. That is the truth, and I want to be clear about it, because it matters to me. I was not going through her phone. I was not following her or checking her location or doing any of the things that a suspicious husband does when suspicion has fully taken hold. I was using the family laptop to print a work document, and her email was open in a browser tab, and a notification appeared at the top of the screen before I could look away. Just a preview. Just a name and the first few words of a message. But the name was one I recognized, and the first few words were not the words of a work colleague discussing a project. And my brain processed both of those facts in about half a second before I clicked away from the tab, without reading further. I sat in front of that laptop for a long time, without printing anything. When Sandra came home that evening, I watched her the way you watch someone when you are trying to reconcile 2 versions of them that cannot both be true at the same time. She was warm, engaged, funny over dinner. She told me a story about something that happened at the office that made me laugh despite everything sitting in my chest. She was, in every visible way, exactly the woman I had married, and that was somehow the hardest part. If she had been cold or distant or guilty-looking, I might have found it easier to bridge the gap between what I had almost seen and what I was now carrying. But she wasn't any of those things. She was just Sandra, sitting across from me, pouring herself a glass of wine, completely at ease in a life she had apparently decided to live in 2 separate directions at once. I brought it up that night. Not the message specifically. I didn't have the words for that yet, but the distance I had been feeling, the late nights, the changes. I said it carefully. The way you say something when you are hoping the other person will meet you in the middle of it and make it easier. She listened. She put her wine glass down. And then she said I was being insecure. She said she had been working incredibly hard, and the last thing she needed was to come home to suspicion. She said she loved me and she was exhausted, and could we please not do this tonight? And I apologized. I apologized to her, sitting at my own kitchen table, at the end of an evening where I had swallowed something that was eating a hole in my stomach. I told her I was sorry for making her feel doubted. She squeezed my hand. She said she understood. She said it had been a stressful few months, and maybe we both needed a vacation. That was the moment she suggested Cancun. The night after Sandra left for Cancun, I sat in the living room with all the lights on and did not watch the television that was playing in front of me. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the program to change twice. Long enough for my coffee to go completely cold. I was doing something that didn't have a clean name. Not grieving, not thinking, not deciding. Something closer to floating in the space between knowing something and being willing to admit that you know it. I had been living in that space for months. It had become a kind of residence. I had learned the layout of its rooms, where the uncomfortable edges were, how to move through it without bumping into the worst parts of it. But sitting alone in that house for the first night, with Sandra's absence pressing against every wall, the space felt smaller and more airless than it ever had before. I went to work the next day because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Work had always been the place where my mind behaved, where the problems had defined edges and the solutions were either correct or they weren't. I had spent my career in a world governed by logic and measurable outcomes and the clean satisfaction of things that functioned as they were designed to. None of that translated to what was happening in my personal life. But being in that environment helped me breathe more evenly. So I went. I sat at my desk. I answered emails. I reviewed schematics. I ate lunch at my desk and didn't taste any of it. Sandra texted in the afternoon. A photograph of the resort pool, bright blue water and palm trees, and a cocktail balanced on the edge of a lounge chair. She added a string of emojis. Sun, wave, heart. I stared at the photo for a long time. I thought about the woman who had taken it. I thought about the message I had almost read on the laptop screen 3 weeks earlier. I typed back a single word, beautiful, and put my phone in my desk drawer and tried to go back to the schematics. The evenings were the hardest part. There is a particular quality to a house at night when you are alone in it, and the aloneness is not peaceful but loaded. Every room held something. The kitchen had the half-finished grocery list on the counter in Sandra's handwriting. The bedroom had her perfume still faint on the pillow she had slept on 2 nights before. The new perfume, the one I hadn't chosen with her. The bathroom had her things arranged on the counter in the specific order she always arranged them, which I had never consciously noticed until now, when noticing it felt unbearable. I started sleeping on the couch after the second night. It was easier than lying in a bed that felt like an argument. I ordered takeout every evening and ate it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting at the table alone felt like a statement I wasn't ready to make. I drank more than I usually did. Not dramatically, not in any way that alarmed me, but a glass or 2 more than my normal. The kind of excess that is less about wanting the drink and more about wanting the 10 minutes of quiet it provided. I called my brother once during that week, started to say something real, and then redirected the conversation to football because I wasn't ready to say out loud what I was only barely capable of thinking privately. The loneliness was not the simple kind. It was not the loneliness of being without company. It was the loneliness of being uncertain about what you had ever actually had. That is a different and more corrosive variety entirely. It reaches backward as well as forward. It doesn't just make you feel alone in the present moment. It rewrites your memory of the past, casting shadows over things you had experienced as warmth and certainty, and making you wonder what was real and what was performance, and whether you would have known the difference even if you had been paying closer attention. I found myself replaying conversations from the previous 2 years, searching them for things I had missed. A hesitation, a contradiction, a moment where the story she told me didn't quite line up with something else I knew. And the terrible thing, the thing that kept me awake on that couch night after night, was that I started finding them. Small ones, barely visible, but there. A weekend conference that I had never thought to verify. A friend she mentioned regularly, whose name I realized I had never heard before the previous year. An evening she came home, saying she had worked late, when I had driven past her office building on the way back from a client meeting, and her car had not been in the lot. Each memory landed like something dropped from a height. Not loud, just heavy. On the fourth day, the kitchen sink started leaking. I noticed it in the morning, a steady drip from the cabinet under the counter. The floor of the cabinet already soft with moisture that had been collecting longer than I realized. I crouched down and looked at it and almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because it felt like an accurate description of my life in that moment. Something had been quietly leaking for a long time, and I had not looked closely enough to catch it before the damage had already spread further than I could see. I called a plumber. His name was Marcus. My neighbor had used him before and said he was reliable and fair. I left him the keypad code for the front door because my schedule that evening was uncertain, and I didn't want him standing on the porch waiting. It was a practical decision, a simple one, the most ordinary transaction imaginable. I had no way of knowing that sending that man into my house while I wasn't there was about to unravel every lie that had been quietly soaking through the floor of my life for the past 2 years. I answered the phone on the second ring and immediately knew something was wrong. Not from the words. He hadn't said anything meaningful yet. Just my name, spoken carefully, followed by a pause that lasted a beat too long. But that pause carried weight, the kind of weight that a person puts into silence when they are deciding how to begin something they wish they did not have to begin at all. I had been sitting in a parking garage for 20 minutes after a client call, too tired to drive, window cracked, listening to the city wind down around me. The call from Marcus pulled me out of that fog instantly. Not gradually, instantly, like a light switched on in a dark room. He told me the sink was done. I registered that information and moved past it immediately because it was clearly not the reason he was calling. His voice had a texture to it that didn't belong in a routine professional update. It was careful in the way that people are careful when they are managing their own reaction to something while simultaneously trying to manage yours. I have heard that kind of careful exactly twice in my life. Once when a doctor called my mother about my father's test results, and once on that night in the parking garage when a plumber called me about a leaking pipe that turned out to be the least important thing he had found in my house. He said there was something in the basement. He said he had needed to move some boxes near the far wall to reach the water access panel, which was a detail I hadn't known because I had never needed to use the access panel myself. He said he found something while he was moving those boxes, and then he stopped. He didn't describe it. He didn't speculate about it. He just stopped and let the silence ask the question for him, which told me more than any description would have. A man who found something innocent doesn't stop like that. A man who found something innocent says what it is. The stopping meant he didn't know how to say what it was, or he knew exactly what it was and couldn't bring himself to name it to a stranger on the phone. I asked him what he found. He said he thought I should come and see it myself. I pressed him. He held the line for a moment and then said quietly that he didn't feel right describing it over the phone. That was the sentence that moved me from unease into something sharper and colder. Not panic. Something more focused than panic. I told him I was on my way. I drove home in a condition I can only describe as suspended. My thoughts were not racing. They were very still, which was somehow worse. A racing mind is still processing, still generating options and outcomes and narratives. A still mind has already arrived somewhere and is just waiting for the body to catch up. Some part of me, in that car on that drive, had already understood that whatever waited in my basement was not going to be simple or small or easily explained away. I had spent months explaining things away. I was out of that particular energy entirely. Marcus was standing in the kitchen with his jacket on and his bag packed and his keys in his hand. He was a man in his mid-50s, solidly built, the kind of person who projects competence and steadiness as a baseline condition. But he did not look steady that night. He looked like a man who had accidentally walked through a door he hadn't meant to open and couldn't figure out how to close it again behind him. He met my eyes when I walked in and held them for a moment, and then looked at the basement door. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I went down the stairs. The basement was cool and smelled the way basements smell, concrete and cardboard, and the particular stillness of air that doesn't move much. The overhead light cast everything in that flat, shadowless brightness that makes familiar spaces look slightly wrong. I moved past the old shelving units and the stacked holiday boxes and the folding table we had never found a use for, toward the far wall where Marcus had been working. The water access panel was open. His tools were still laid out beside it, which told me he had stopped mid-job when he found whatever he found. That detail registered. He had stopped working. Whatever it was had stopped him entirely. The duffel bag was behind the last stack of boxes. Black, medium-sized, the kind of generic bag that could belong to anyone. It had been placed there deliberately, not dropped, not forgotten, not left carelessly. Placed, positioned behind boxes that were heavy enough that no one would move them without a specific reason. It had been put there by someone who understood the geography of that basement. Someone who knew which corner never got touched. I crouched down and unzipped it. The cash was banded in neat stacks. I didn't count it that night. I counted it later and arrived at $47,000, but I could see immediately that it was substantial. Beside the cash was a phone. Not Sandra's regular phone. The one I knew. The one that lay face down on every surface. A different phone. Smaller. A prepaid model. And beneath the phone was a manila folder. And inside the folder were printed documents, photographs, hotel receipts, screenshots of conversations, a timeline of dates and locations organized with a neatness that was more frightening than the cash or the phone, because neatness requires time and intention and planning. I sat down on the cold concrete floor without deciding to sit down. My back was against the wall, and the folder was open across my knees, and the overhead light was making everything very clear and very flat and very real. And the thing that struck me most in that moment was not anger and not grief, but a profound, disorienting clarity, the specific clarity that arrives when something you have been almost knowing for a long time finally steps fully into the light, and you see it completely for the first time, and realize that some part of you has been seeing it all along.